Evening, everybody. Welcome to the PMI Victorian History Library. For those I haven't met before, my name's Judith Ellis. I'm President of the Library and Chair of the Board. And can I also acknowledge some other fellow board members here, which is Dennis, just here, and Michelle, up front. So thanks for coming along. And a very warm welcome to our guest this evening, Dr Jarrad Paul. And he's going to talk to us about going out in 19th century Melbourne. So our library is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And we also acknowledge First Nations peoples' rich history of knowledge keeping and knowledge management. It's an inspiration to us all. Just a bit of admin, if you like, or to do with our facilities. If you want the bathroom, out the door that you came in through, or this one, and it's basically on the other side of this wall. Okay, so they're there. And we have two emergency exits. One, again, is back through the door where you came in, or through here and down to that end of the passage. And of course, if there is an emergency, we'll make sure our staff take you safely out of the building. So this year, we're just going to fly a flag for a minute. It's a momentous occasion for the library here. We're celebrating our 170th birthday or anniversary. We were established in 1854 and we're the second oldest library in Victoria. And we have a collection of over 40,000 items and take great pride in being the sole library in Australia with such an extensive collection, which is also available for loan and covers a vast array of topics. And our focus is largely on local history within Victoria, of course, housing a wealth of information that encompasses most of our towns, if not all of our towns across Victoria. So Ellen here, our library staff, and Lauren's at the back there, our chief librarian, but we'll be taking photographs and videos throughout the session, and we use this for promotional purposes. Plus it means you can, if you want to, go back and watch this talk all over again on YouTube, or for friends that have missed out, you can give them a link and they can go and watch it on YouTube. But if you prefer not to be included in any of the photography, make sure you let us know and you can accommodate that. So I'd now like to welcome Dr Jarrad Paul, who is a Senior Archaeologist at Dr Vincent Clark Archaeology and Heritage, and he'll be taking us back in time, illuminating what it meant to go out in the 19th century. And as it is for 2024, I'm sure this is going to include fashion and eating and drinking and entertainment. So we look forward to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction. Hi everyone, and thanks for coming out tonight. Before I start, I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which we are meeting, pay my respects to the elders past and present, and also Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. So tonight's talk looks at the idea of going out in 19th century Melbourne, taking both an archaeological but also a historical approach to understand what people were wearing, eating, drinking and watching during three distinct years in Melbourne's history. I've chosen 1842, 1867 and 1893 for this. These years were chosen to track the development from early colonial settlement to the dazzling heights brought about by the gold rushes to the crashing reality of a city in financial crisis by the end of the decade. So this talk is also given in conjunction with the currently showing Collective City Showcase here at the library, which presents historical photographs of Melbourne from government archives alongside images representing the city today by contemporary street photographers. So when I was asked to give this talk, graciously, I was provoked to start asking questions about what performance was involved to enter the public space in the past. So as an archaeologist, we are often tasked with reimagining the past using the physical remains from those who are left behind. And my previous work investigating the prehistory, actually, of Anatolia and Greece, and also later Southeast Asia, I was given this task with no written records, as it is prehistory. And so you are left with an interpretive leap into the unknown, which can sometimes be quite painstaking. However, working on historical Melbourne sites in recent years, this task has been aided by the historical record that can help support theories of individuals living at certain sites in conjunction with their material remains. So when I'm trying to catch a breath from being stooped over a spoil heap, as you probably saw from that first photo with a pickaxe in my hand, I often try to imagine the sort of lives people lived in Melbourne from the material that we are excavating. I also like to compare, a bit like these pictures, when I can, the modern with the historical, to go at least some way to bridge the distinct gap between us now and those before. A bit like the juxtaposition of the images in the gallery, it is the main reason why I've centered this talk around the act of going out, as it incorporates dressing up, dining out, and also entertainment, rather than treating these as three distinct separate groups. Something that us archaeologists tend to do is separate. For instance, you can get lost in the detail of distinctive type of glassware from various places and time periods, understood by pattern recognition, learnt from many years of study. However, as I said to a friend a few months back when we were watching the cricket at the G, the people I'm sitting here aren't really concerned with the type of Coke plastic bottle, as we can see here, dated to 2023, that they are drinking from. They are, though, in the process of having a night out, a day out, and they're wearing event-suitable attire. They're also eating suitable food and drink and watching the game in this instance, all of which is interacting with the very artefacts that future archaeologists will be studying. So in terms of how this talk will be presented, a bit of an overview. I'll start with a fairly brief overview of the history and archaeological background of the city before going into a deep dive of the three selected years. I'll finish up with some overall thoughts as well into this topic and leave some time at the end for any questions for discussion. So just a bit of background, I'm sure as you are aware, and for some of you who may not be as familiar with the history of Melbourne, the first people who occupied the area that is now Melbourne, members of the Kulin Nation, continuously inhabited the greater part of Melbourne for at least 35,000 years before European settlement. Small-scale attempts at permanent European settlement were unsuccessful until Batman's occupation on the banks of the river. In 1835, parties of settlers led by Batman and John Lacey eventually laid out a new settlement in 1837, the same year the city received its current name. Land was cleared along what is now Flinders Street to make way for emerging permanent structures of timber, stone and brick. Among these early buildings, which are still standing today, La Trobe's Cottage, and also churches such as St James's Old Cathedral. Land was also allocated for sheep and cattle runs further away from Port Phillip Bay, and from 1836 to the end of the decade, the settlement's population grew from a few hundred to a few thousand. By the start of the 1840s, the number of sheep reached around 1 million. Land was divided for sale, with resale values skyrocketing at the beginning of the 1840s. However, a slump in wool prices, coupled with a quickly accelerated land market, led to a brief economic depression in the colony by our date of 1842. So just briefly as well about some archaeological work in the city now. There's been some excellent overviews written about the wide-ranging and exciting excavations that have occurred in the CBD since the implementation of the Heritage Act in the mid-1990s. Large-scale excavations have dominated much of the analysis, though, and understanding of 19th century Melbourne, such as works at Castleton Place, the Carlton United Brewery, and more recently with major infrastructure projects, such as Metro Tunnel. Smaller site-specific excavations have also occurred throughout the CBD, and they delve deep into the city's early history, such as excavations at Jones Lane, Langlands Foundry, and sites along La Trobe, Burke, and Elizabeth Streets. There's also been numerous other investigations throughout the city. However, we're working with developer-led projects, which often means we have tight deadlines, tight budgets as well. But the current legislation, which is fantastic and not always, we shouldn't take it for granted, I should say. The current legislation allows for investigation of these areas to further our understanding of the city's past. So the artefacts or refuse left behind form part of the material record investigated by archaeologists throughout the city. These often include objects made of inorganic materials such as ceramic, glass, metal, leather, and also organic materials such as bone and shell. So the bone remains of particular interest, especially to the talk tonight. I'm also a little biased because my background is also in animal bone studies, so go animal bones. But they do inform us, importantly, of the dietary patterns and consumer practices across the period of time. Unfortunately, it seems that bone and shells do receive a little less love when compared to their ceramic and glass counterparts. Again, I'm a little biased. So hopefully tonight I can shed a little bit more light on the topic. So with the background behind us, let's make our first stop to 1842 to see what people were leaving their modest accommodation for. So by August 1842, it's all Melbourne being incorporated as a town by the Governor of New South Wales, which gave this infant city its first sense of individuality. By the end of the year, the Melbourne City Council was established and its first mayor, Henry Condell, was elected. The people who lived in the town were largely associated with the pastoral industries and services to support those coming into the colony. These largely skewed towards males as well, who outnumbered their female counterparts in the colony for the first half of the century, although women, of course, played a vital role in the colony and especially in the decades to follow. Thus, occupations for individuals broadly encompassed professionals, merchants, labourers and entertainers, all of which were in need of a bit of time off from the day-to-day grind. So, before you left your lodgings, you needed to make sure you were dressed appropriately, not only for the occasion, but for your role in society. So, for women, the silhouette of the time, 1842, was the long-waisted bodice, narrow sleeves and the dome-shaped full skirt. This silk evening dress example here from the Powerhouse Museum provides a picture of this style with the sloping shoulder line and, of course, all handmade either locally or shipped over from northern London. A simpler version of the dress as well and of the fashion of the preceding, of the previous decades can be seen here with the example of a doll owned by John Batman's daughter, Elizabeth, who would have been quite well-to-do in the early colony, considering who her dad was. This example typifies, though, a more common dress style, with white and cooler fabrics such as cotton, silk, and muslin, with, of course, a bonnet being worn. The bonnet was an essential piece if you needed to go out during the day, especially in Australia, to protect yourself from the harsh, damaging sun. So for the men, the choice was simpler. Shock horror, what a surprise, men get it easier. However, especially in the 1840s, the decorative looks of the previous decades moved to a more austere Victorian look. Once you've slipped out of your nightdress, the upper and middle class professionals changed into a suit consisting of a shirt, waistcoat, trousers, longer frock coat, scarf, leather shoes, and also a hat, which was a must. Pants, as we can see here, often always were different in colour as well. So this example, again, is dated from the 1840s from the Powerhouse Museum and shows the refined tailoring and, again, preference for lighter materials such as linen to adapt to Australia's harsher climate. Melbournians also took their cue from what was happening back in the homeland in the UK. For those of the working class, the same basic clothing types were widespread: trousers, shirt, waistcoat, a longer coat, hat and scarf. However, in a more basic form, either material-wise or in the cut. Looking at the archaeological material as well as surviving examples of clothing, it's almost impossible to find a full set or anything to do with clothing of the time due to the degradation of the material. In the ground anyway. Therefore, it's in most cases, it's only attachments like the buttons we can see here from two digs in the city, dated from the period, that are recovered from the sites that we dig. But if you're looking for advice on the latest types of clothing and just the general goings-on in the colony, you could look no further than the Port Phillip Patriot and Melbourne Advertiser, also known just as the Melbourne Advertiser, operated by John Faulkner. Since 1839. So, for instance, this article, which I love from the World of Fashion, outlines an update from the homeland. This update provides even the most minute details, including what you should be wearing in terms of colour, cut, and also the exact length of certain items. So we are now dressed and we're ready to be seen by our fellow settlers to this new colony. So let's venture out for some food. The early years of the colony, imported food was essential, and supplemented by the agricultural economy that had been set up to keep the people well watered and fed. Meat and flour were, of course, the main commodities early on, but agricultural activities on the urban fringes also centred around orchards and fruit growing, also vineyards for the production of wine. So where did you collect this food from? Where did you buy this food? Where did you purchase this food? If you wanted to purchase, the Western Market, established just the year before in 1841 between Collins Street and Flinders Lane, just adjacent to the Customs House, was the place to go. You would purchase fruit and vegetables from other items directly off the back of a parked wagon, a bit like the modern day smaller village like setups that we have today, in a fenced area. But for this talk and for tonight, we're not interested in cooking for ourselves. Why would we be? We want to eat out. So where are we going to go? 1842 Melbourne. We're going to the pub. That's where we're going. John Faulkner also tried his hand at being a publican, and he owned one of Melbourne's first pubs, the Land's Inn, which we can see here from a later 19th century depiction of it, on the corner of Collins and Market Street. It was reported to be of simple construction, a bit like most of the other buildings surrounded at the time, made of simple timber and brick. Reflective articles, again, of the late 19th and early 20th century also describe Melbourne's early pub scenes with a few other examples, including the Royal Highlander on Queen Street and also the Governor Burke Hotel near the Lamb Inn. So dropping in for a drink, you might avail yourselves with some of the imported alcohol, including beer, cider, brandy, gin, rum or whiskey. Here's just one example of a bottle retrieved from the Commonwealth Block excavations. However, recently, in many of our digs in the CBD, finding complete and also fragmented bottle types from this period is always quite interesting. But if you're not in the mood for alcohol, you might want to try some ginger beer or aerated soda. Aerated soda in particular is known for its health benefits, either imported or newly locally made from Rose Aerated Soda. We can see a nice little advertising here from 1841 that is being shipped over to Melbourne for the first time, although it's been originated from Tasmania. Unlike now, though, soda was primarily sold in pharmacists to promote its health benefits rather than any food establishments like now you would get a Coke, for example, or the non-alcohol option. But in terms of dishes, we're quite hungry. So what's on the menu? On the menu is a lot of heavier cuts of mutton and lamb, beef, and fish made into soups and stews. For instance, there's advertising here from the Port Phillip Gazette for purchase, including some of the items that you might find on the menu of the day, including fresh salmon, oysters, mock turtle soup, turkey, lamb's head, and other versions such as pie of venison, also a pie of grouse, roasted duck, stewed fowl, mulligatawny, a type of spiced curry soup, and of course oxtail soup. So out of all of these, I think I'll go with the mock turtle because it does stand out to me. You know, it's got a delightful name, originally made from actual turtles. However, by the time we get to this iteration of what mock turtle was, we're looking at taking a calf's brain and also organ meat and putting them together into a nice stewed curry or gravy that we can see here today, which sounds delicious. In fact, actually, a recent excavation on Burke Street that we've been involved with, we've uncovered such edible bones that we can say that's probably related to a dish of this kind, particularly with the calf's head that's been found. So we've had our feed and perhaps we're sufficiently buzzed. So what are we going to see? What are the leisure activities that are out there for this new town? Well, if it's summer and during the day, we might want to show our patriotism by going to a cricket game. 5 years earlier, 5 Englishmen established the Melbourne Cricket Club and organised games, the first of which involved the military versus the civilians, played on a paddock off William Street. Subsequently, teams were established based largely on occupation and by default class, with traders and artisans forming their own union club by the next year. But by 1842, teams and players were organised and played in an ad hoc basis during the summer. A report from January 1842 actually tells of the government officials versus the civilians game, of which the government officials won. It reminds me of the Star Wars quote, "Let the Wookiee win." You don't want to upset the local guard. Other reports of games also included the bearded versus the non-shaven, and even the bachelors versus the husbands. So everyone had a role, everyone had a chance to play a bit of cricket. But the rules were a bit different back then, with underarm bowling allowed and only 4 balls per over. This is some example images of some of the suburban grounds that sort of later popped up around Melbourne. But unfortunately, cricket isn't your thing. You might want to wait until March, when the first annual Melbourne show was held at the end of Elizabeth Street. This was held by the Pastoral Agricultural Society of Australia. A description of the event described the awards for Best in Show, a variety of animals, including horses, pigs, cattle. However, at the time, due to the slight dip in the Depression, sheep were not present to be awarded anything because there were no sheep. However, of note, a giant watermelon won from Captain Smythe's garden, an indication that big fruit is always fascinating to everybody. The members of this committee, no doubt in their finest apparel, as we've seen earlier on, had dinner promptly at 6, and the meal was provided by the Royal Hotel, which again, hopefully was delicious. Also, hopefully had some of those dishes as well that we've described before. But we're interested in going out at night. Sometimes daytime activities can be a bit boring. So what are we going to do when we have a night to ourselves? Well, we're lucky that the theatre, the Royal Victoria Theatre, also known as the Amateur Theatre, the Pavilion, the Theatre Royale, the Victoria Saloon, had many names, it opened until June of 1842. Performances were led by George Buckingham, which included Rob Roy, The Widow's Victim, and also a play called The Lottery Ticket. The crowds, though, at this event are known to be noisy and quite disruptive. It may have to do with the high ticket prices, nothing's changed. And of course, the venue itself, described as a bit of a ramshackle timber structure across the road from the equally as noisy Eagle Tavern on Burke Street. However, a report from the Melbourne Advertiser in June 1842, when it was scheduled to close, recounted the success of the theatre for the people of Melbourne, and also mentions that it was the town's only public amusement for night time. The theatre itself, however, closed a few years later, but a new theatre was opened, the Queen's Theatre Royale. But it is the best bet for now to be built for an exciting and excellent night out if you wanted to head out in 1842 in Melbourne. But we can't get too comfortable with 1842. We need to keep moving on to our next year of interest in 19th century Melbourne, 1867. And I wonder if any major event will occur in the next 20 years. Well, of course, gold happened. The gold rushes of the 1850s and into the 1860s was a major boom for the city and placed the city on the international map for the first time. The influx of people into Melbourne was not only just for gold prospecting, but also for a variety of adjacent needs to support such a rush, such as feeding, housing, and entertaining all these new migrants. As a result, by 1865, Melbourne was the most populous city in Australia, with the population in the tens of thousands. The gold rushes also did not help with the balance of gender, with a ratio of almost 2 to 1 for male to female. However, this quickly was balanced with the first generation of Australian-born children to immigrant parents in the preceding decade. This is also, of course, the era of bushrangers and law surrounding these characters travelled far and wide. Infrastructure of all sorts as well sprung up across the city, including Princess's Bridge, Melbourne Uni, Flinders Street Station, the State Library, the original Melbourne Town Hall, also the original Spencer Street Station, Queen Vic Market, Melbourne Town Hall, and the NGV. Plus, don't forget the Melbourne Zoo. The city was certainly alive and thriving by 1867, where we find ourselves. It is important to note, however, that the continuing disparity of the inhabitants of the city at this time, as noted in discussions quite widely by archaeologists in a lot of the research, has been noted based on class. If you made your money benefiting from the inflow of capital, for example, in the previous decade, the town was truly a marvellous Melbourne. However, for those not lucky enough to strike it rich, either as a result of failed mining attempts or maybe just poor luck and timing, then your experience of the city was one of survival. While the historical record tends to skew to the experience of the middle and upper classes, archaeology in the city has been able to provide some insights into the daily lives of those just trying to eke out a living. So we begin again with the first task of the day, which is getting dressed. For women in the middle and upper classes, the elaborate ritual of getting ready was at least a little easier when compared to the 1850s, the height of the wide crinoline enhanced by artificial cages which accentuated the hips. This is quite a nice little example here, which is a fancy dress of cut out newspaper articles stitched together to wear to a fancy dress event, which was quite nice. But by the end of the 1860s, however, this trend was in reverse, with the width of the dress reducing and only remaining at the back with the introduction of the bustle, as you can see here in some of those other articles. Again, the article from the Leader paper makes it very clear that crinolines are out. This is from the Queen as well, so we have to listen. The length of the dress was also questioned up until then, as you can see here, long dresses dragging through the streets, described here in one example with a yard of silk that could drag through all the mire and muck of the streets. So it was a push to get the length of the skirt to be at least a little bit higher. Also, you can't forget the hair, usually done up or worn with an upturned bonnet tied to the chin, and shoes made of leather or satin if around the house. Leather shoes are actually quite important too. One of the surviving examples that we find as archaeologists when we dig through the city, leather that has been in the ground, and so it's preserved at least somewhat, can make up the styles of what people were wearing. Styles were also dictated by those in Europe, however. The colony's preference with brighter colours, including whites, were still common, as were lighter fabrics as well. But for those of the lower classes, the styles and silhouettes remained similar, but you would usually only have poorer tailoring and poorer fabrics. I like to think of it as the H&M outfit of the day. For the guys, the overall look pretty much stayed the same. Again, shock horror. Trouser, shirt, waistcoat, coat, hat and tie. But looking at the smaller details, changes have occurred, including the shortening of the coat, hats becoming a little bit taller, also neckties were a little bit wider and looped or in a loose knot. An article from the Australasian paper also marks out that even further detail with a shift in style with the signet ring moving from your little finger to your ring finger. So that's a little style trick for 1867. Shopping the latest looks, however, was also divided between class lines. For those in the upper and middle classes, the fashionable shops were located on Collins Street, as you can see here, people doing the block, as it was called. If the thought of getting all dressed up, though, was just way too much for you to go shopping, you could also mail order direct from London, from the convenience of your own home. And in most cases, these purchases were made off in instalments, a bit like the lay-by system that we have today. However, if you're in the lower classes, you had to resort to open-air marketplaces, and you would be purchasing a lot of second-hand items, second-hand material, and most likely fashions that were from the previous decades. It's now time to eat. So again, thanks to the gold rushes, the past few decades put Melbourne also on the culinary map. Hotels, inns and eating houses have sprung up around the city, offering dishes to cater for everybody. For instance, on Burke Street, the White Horse Hotel would have offered a variety of drinks and reasonable food. There's many instances of people stumbling out. There's even a story of two men stumbling out to find another man face down in a horse trough from the Burke Street Hotel. Other established hotels and inns also offered patrons a substantive meal of stewed meat and bread with a drink of your choice. Likewise, you could also frequent the Oyster Saloon, which were common to the city, like the one at 195 Elizabeth Street. That opened in 1867, and the saloon offered oysters as a cheap and quick food source, unlike today, of course, where they're normally reserved for upper-end establishments. And also, oyster remains are usually found in many yard and cesspit contexts dating to the 19th century across Melbourne. As we get onto a site as an archaeologist, it's one of those great indications of 19th century Melbourne, along with clay pipes. So, tragically, however, overfishing in the decades to come led to the near decimation of the reefs around Melbourne, and just recently, just at the start of February, actually, a great article has just been released on the topic, which is well worth a read if you're interested. But if you're looking to eat in a more reputable establishment, perhaps you could try the newly opened Menzies Hotel, the first in a line of grand Victorian hotels of the era, on the corner of Burke and William Streets. But if French was your thing, the Café de Paris within the Theatre Royal was the place to be. The menu of the time includes joints of meat, poultry, game birds, also a vast variety of desserts, seasonal vegetables and fruits. And for a nice fixed price, you can get yourself a cut of beef steak, potatoes, and a glass of ale. Sounds great. I want it now. Also popular on the menu of the time was rabbit stew. This is a nice little picture of a modern example of rabbit stew. Rabbit bones are also found frequently in the zoo archaeological remains at most sites in the CBD for Melbourne. And while rabbits were first introduced at time of first contact, the current large numbers seem to have originated with the release of over a dozen near Winchelsea in 1859. By 1866, 50,000 were in the surrounding regions. And in the decades to come, the number grew exponentially. In fact, by 1920, the rabbit industry in general was the largest employer of labour in Australia, which is quite interesting. Also makes for a delicious cut of meat. So now we turn ourselves to and our attention to the events that drew in the people from this year, 1867. In January and February, the Intercolonial Exhibition was still open at the State Library if you wanted to have a look. It had the best stalls, and the best ones would be nominated to represent the colony in Paris. Exhibits covered everything from the arts and manufacturing to foodstuffs and agriculture. During the winter months, you could actually watch the 10th season of quite a new game, and now one of Melbourne's most famous exports, the footy. First codified in 1858, by 1867, teams familiar now were playing each other, such as Melbourne, Geelong, Carlton, and they would play against university and high school teams, with the university and high school teams playing with a handicap applied. So you would have grown men against younger lads running around. Rules set out in 1860 show some things haven't changed, of course, such as the need for a coin toss, a mark for catching the ball, and you had to throw the ball in if it bounced outside the boundary. However, some things have changed for the better, such as not being able to lift the ball from the ground, which was an original rule, because of football, I guess. Later in the year, you might also make your way to Flemington for the 7th instalment of the Melbourne Cup. The race is infamous for the name of the winning horse that year, Tim Whiffler, as we can see here, that's Tim, which was actually the name of 2 horses entered into the event. So there was 2 Tim Whifflers. To avoid the confusion on the day, they decided, let's call one Sydney Tim and we'll call the other one Melbourne Tim. However, unfortunate for everyone else in this room, Sydney Tim won and took home this trophy. Trophies being introduced only the year before, actually for Melbourne Cup. Before that, you would just win a nice gold pocket watch. So yeah, Tim lucked out. He got a trophy. Reports of the day mentioned the CBD as desolate, as throngs of observers made their way west, either by carriage or by foot. But this year's biggest draw card, of course, was Prince Alfred's trip, the first royal trip down under. His arrival in Melbourne in November drew massive crowds, eager to get a glimpse of royalty for the first time. This culminated in the must-go event of the year, a public banquet planned for initially 10,000 people on the banks of the Yarra, and it offered free food, free meat, free bread, free vegetables, along with free wine and free beer for everyone. So what happens when you give people free stuff? Well, a description of the event in the Argus the day after tells us. And it shows, however, the number of actual attendees reached 50 to 60,000. By 2 p.m, the Prince was an hour late. And on a hot November day, the crowd couldn't stand it anymore, rushed and grabbed whatever they could from the feast. Chaos ensued, booze was looted, and Alfred actually never showed up. Due to a risk of violence, there was also an assassination attempt on his life previously, so he's probably a little bit wary of the Australians, especially of the Melbournians. The lesson learned from the Argus that day was don't give people anything for free. So we leave 1867 in the midst of merriment with seemingly no end to Melbourne's progress. While true for the ensuing decades, things would come to a grinding halt, which would cause a flow-on effect for the fashion, food and entertainment industries. So we are now arriving in 1893. The 1870s and 1880s saw the largest building boom in Australian history, concentrated mainly in urban centres. In Melbourne, civic buildings including the Royal Mint, the Royal Exhibition Building and the Block Arcade were constructed. Towards the end of the 1880s, however, the building boom came to a stop, and it was fueled by many economic factors, such as the decrease in wool prices, climate factors as well. There was a drought, also, of course, the flood in 1891, and this all led to a fall in capital and investment from overseas. As a result, bank runs caused widespread panic, and by 1893, 54 of the 64 banks that were open 3 years previously had closed. The flow-on effect also on the jobs market meant that 1 in 3 were also unemployed. So we find ourselves in May 1893 in the middle of a 5-day bank holiday imposed by the Victorian government to prevent further bank runs. I guess, don't have a job, but you get a 5-day holiday. So if you were lucky enough to still retain your wealth, women's dress styles had had enough with the wide crinoline and bustle, and instead it's all about the thin waist snatched to the gods, as we can see here, with the natural drape. Corsets were a must to achieve the look, and the volume shifted, and it was on the arms and the shoulders, as you can see here. For men, single-breasted suits with a hat, either a flat cap or a top hat, were popular, with collars either folded over or upstanding with a necktie or a bow tie. The clean-shaven look was also coming back, or you could opt for a well-groomed moustache, which was also respectable. However, one subset of the male community were dressing quite differently to make an impact. So we have here what we know as larrikins, the larrikin style, which was prevalent in the early 1870s and the late 1890s. It was popular among mischievous youths, usually unskilled labourers, and also street walkers. So the look was quite distinctive. You would have to wear high-heeled leather boots, bell-bottom trousers, very 70s, stiff brim hat, short jackets, not long jackets, with a velvet collar, a patterned necktie. We can see here an example of a checkerboard necktie, one by one such larrikin. And many of these clothes were either second-hand, stolen, or had been altered by family members. Throw in a radical haircut. At the time, larrikins were known to have a mohawk, using a straight razor to shave one side of the head. And you've got the look. However, for all others who had fallen on hard times, they might have been mistaken as a larrikin because of just the need to be able to wear whatever clothing they could stitch together, either by alterations or by purchasing second-hand. So we turn to food, and for those doing it rough, there were still food options to keep you going. Heading down to South Melbourne, a relief society was set up to provide locals with the most basic staples of meat, bread, sugar, and a hot drink. Also, if you waited long enough at the South Melbourne market on a Saturday night after trading, you might be able to score yourself some of the leftover produce and meat that was unsold from that day. Alternative food options were also found in the city as well, if you knew where to look. For instance, a number of Chinese restaurants, or as they were known, cook shops, had opened on the eastern end of Little Bourke Street, a result of an initial strong migration from the gold rushes, which resulted in the establishment of a large Chinese contingent in the city. Chinese farmers were also productive in the gardens on the outskirts of the city, providing fresh produce. The restaurants on Bourke Street, for example, there was one at 209 Little Bourke Street, He Yik, was surrounded by grocers, tea and fruit merchants, and also furniture manufacturers, all set up within the same area. Most descriptions of these establishments, however, and of Chinese people in general, were almost always associated with negative connotations, even the drawing style, quite negative. And the food, however, would have been of the Southern Chinese style. It's still today when you get a Chinese takeout, it's mainly Southern Chinese style. And it's based on fresh fruit, vegetables, fish, poultry, pork, and of course rice. Bringing it back to the zoo archaeological remains and what we find on site as archaeologists, pork and pig bones are a particular good indication of perhaps a non-English diet, which was also largely constricted to sheep, goat, and beef types over pork. So if you're finding pork, then there might be something happening. However, maybe you've done quite well in Melbourne, you've been able to ride out the times, you still have your job. The food scene, as it is now, was still thriving. European restaurants also littered the streets, including the Spanish-inspired Crystal Cafe, as you can see here, quite a nice dining room and cafe setup. Also, the French Vienna Cafe and the Café Anglaise were also popular at the time. Opened in 1893 was another, Café de Net, on Little Collins Street. This is the article mentioning its arrival. The Herald's article of the cafe was in keeping with the times, though. They were very considerate. They would charge a lower price, maybe it's just to get people through the door, but they had a Parisian menu, which included, for example, at lunch, you could get yourself some oysters, soup, and vegetables with some wine. What's interesting about Café de Net is that it actually moved from its original location, and where it was situated is now Florentino's, which was set up in the 1920s. So again, if you allow me to indulge myself in animal bones and all things animals, when trying to piece together the diets of people in the past and everything that I've been trying to explain today about menus and how we normally interact with food, not looking at bones, but the actual meat. The zoo archaeological remains help with this recreation, most notably in the types and cuts of meat that we find behind. So for example, if you are finding a lot of extremities which offer the least amount of nutritional value, you might be able to say this is associated with perhaps a lower establishment. Meanwhile, cuts from the hind limbs and the forelimbs offered more nutritional value and of more worth. However, if drinking gorgeous French wine and having a delicious meal isn't your thing, you could also try out the many coffee palaces, which now spread across the city. These were spurred by the numerous temperance movements of the 19th century, which advocated for the absence of alcohol. By 1888, with more than 50 dotted around the city, the most famous being the Grand Coffee Palace, as we can see here, later turned into the Windsor Hotel on Spring Street. These venues also had food, basic food, stews, for example. However, by our time period of 1893, you might actually have a hard time finding one that was, one, still open, two, wasn't exclusive to men, and three, didn't actually acquire a liquor license, which kind of defeats the purpose of the Coffee Palace in the first place. But I guess on hard times, people continued to turn to alcohol to get them through, as we can sort of normally see with our history, with the tea houses actually being more of a popular choice among non-alcoholic drinkers. So amongst the doom and gloom of the Depression, what event could cheer us up and even the most downtrodden of society? A trip to the market. And the most boisterous of them all was the Easter Market. Located with frontages on Burke, Elizabeth and Little Collins Street, the market originally opened in 1847 as a produce market only, and then expanded and was redesigned in the late 1870s to include two-storey buildings and stalls. By the 1880s and into the 1890s, the market had numerous food and amusement stalls and became the hub of Saturday night nightlife in the city. A carnival-like atmosphere was prevalent throughout, from the descriptions, with the new owner in 1881, E.W. Cole, revitalising the area to include focus on entertainment for a Saturday night, alongside it being a venue for produce and purchasing second-hand clothing during the day. So if you were peckish while you were out wandering through the Easter Market, there was no shortage of sweets and confectionaries that you could take. For those daring as well, there was sideshows that could keep you occupied all night, with shooting galleries, electric shock machines, and even getting your fortune told by Madame Zingerlee. You could also see the miracles of dentistry from the famed American doctor who would just pull out teeth and leave you be. Or you could also admire Charlie the Tattooed Man, who's one of my favourites. You could also watch a puppet show, or perhaps maybe you're dressed up in your larrikin gear and you're in the crowd, you might set up to watch a scandalous peep show that was also at the Easter Market. But, continuing in this vein, maybe for some of those larrikins, the night wasn't quite finished and the peep show wasn't enough. And they weren't done with their Saturday night, so they may have wandered over to Little Lonsdale Street, a notorious area for its slums and brothels. Much has been written on the area and the town thanks to excavations over the past decades. Most recently at Jones Lane with Vincent Archaeology and Heritage, some of the people right here working in that exact area. One of the many fascinating aspects of the excavation for Jones Lane was the animal remains and the insights that it provides as to the clientele of a particular brothel in that area. Here it was found that an abundance of chicken humerus and tibia bones alongside shellfish suggested that meals were eaten for convenience and they were light when compared to the usual animal bone assemblages seen in a lot of domestic settings, which favoured stews and other heavier dishes. So in other words, they were meals for convenience, as you can imagine why. Much other fascinating insights, particularly into the women of the area, have been written and are well worth a read to get a glimpse. We've also got a couple of experts in the crowd that will be more than happy to talk at length about it. So, ends our night in 1893, stumbling back to our lodgings, trying to forget about the state of the city and the state of affairs as we enjoy what we can of our imposed holiday. This also brings us to the end of the talk tonight and our brief look at fashions, food and entertainment in Melbourne during the 19th century. So to sum up in broad brushstrokes, to go out in Melbourne largely depended on your circumstances, such as your class. For those in the upper classes, the need to keep up with the latest trends and styles would have almost been a full-time occupation in itself. But for those of the lower classes, however, options were limited, but did not necessarily bar someone from being part of the performative aspect of going out with others. As an archaeologist, as you can hear, there's some of us here, it is our job to build a puzzle using whatever pieces are left behind to recreate what life was like in the past. As we've seen tonight, we do this by taking small aspects of material culture, for example, the animal bones left behind from a delicious meal, and slowly build up a picture of an individual, a group, and also a society. Bringing this back to the collective city showcase that we can see here tonight, which juxtaposes the modern with the historical, I hope that tonight's talk has helped you get a better understanding of what it was like to be an early settler or a wealthy Melbourneite, or even a cheeky larrikin in Melbourne during the 19th century by framing the conversation of the artefacts and everything we find on site in what we can all understand a great night out. Thank you.
Questions, comments? I think I'm going to give you a mock turtle soup.
Oh, that's delicious.
I'm vegetarian.
Oh, sorry.
Right.
In Georgina McRae's book, she refers to two young ladies named Williamson who complimented on their appearance at a government house ball. Well, those ladies were my great-great-grandfather's sister and sisters, and they came here in 1839. So where would a government house ball have been originally held?
Yeah, in the wealthier to-do establishments that you would hold the type of event in. You would need to make sure you're wearing your finest frocks for the evening. But yeah, Customs House earlier on would have been one of the main civic buildings. But yeah, as you progress, it's class-based. I mean, as we can see there, the Melbourne Show, for example, people of the highest order were sitting out and feasting in what would have been a temporary makeshift area as well. But yeah, early on, it would have been in some of the more established buildings that would have been there. But depending on whatever time it would have been the most splendid or magnificent area that you could get. Also probably the one you could book the easiest and other people weren't visiting. Prince Alfred might have bumped you out the list if he was in town.
How widespread were the opium dens?
I think, it's looking at the historical records, it's always a bit difficult to recreate exactly because a lot of the information gets conflated together. And so, for example, where that image was, where I've cropped just the eatery was a description of the notorious slums and areas, and it had a picture of the opium dens in that area. And I think a lot of the descriptions of the time, for example, the hansom cab, which gives probably the best indication of Melbourne, late 1880s, 1890s, and what it was like in that area, in terms of from a book point of view, would bring that all together. So, regardless of whether it was actually happening or not, it's that, you have to be reading whatever the sources are from there. Obviously it was happening, but to the extent and to the how much it was there, I think we have to be a bit careful when piecing together that historical record as well, for how much was actually there and widespread. But in terms of archaeology, we haven't across much of that.
One of the most popular talks we had in our historical society was by Meg Golding, talking about the dig by young Jacksons, where they had to reinforce young Jacksons.
Yeah.
And you'd have been pleased to know, if you don't already, that there was a butcher in the excavation, so there's lots of animal bones. And there was also a dentist, and so there's lots of teeth.
Yes.
And also a comment about, you mentioned degradation of suits. And I've been to the costume collection, which was in Berlin by Lowell Thompson, and she was saving costumes with air conditioning and whatever, right back to the 1780s.
Yeah, it's like I was saying, it's the attachments normally that when we're on a site we find due to the soil conditions, and again, based on my background, which is tens of thousands of years that I've looked at previously, how quick a item of clothing or something like that can degrade in the soil, depending on the type of soil. can be extremely quick. And so, yeah, that's why leather, a lot of the leather that we're able to recover, it's quite nice when we find something of an article of clothing that when we're digging we can find it. Maybe it's even just a shoe base or a piece of it. But yeah, that was a great dig, great report at the young age. Excellent. Yeah.
So for archaeologists in 100 years' time, they're not going to find much of what we did or wore or whatever, because everything is just so disposable, so degradable.
Yeah, it depends, I guess, as well on the type of materials that we have. A lot of the fibres that we have now are plastics as well. So depending on that type of whether it actually survives, as opposed to a lot of the wool or linen or cotton that would obviously easily degrade. But yeah, plastic. I mean, I've got a plastic bottle right here. Plastic's going to be. I think we're going to be the plastic age to future archaeologists. Yeah, that's going to be our
Especially in our
legacy.
waterways.
Yes.
There were also circuses and picnics along the Yarra on the boat. They get on in the picnics. And there was something else I just had on my mind too. There's all sorts of, the regatta
Yes.
on the Yarra.
So many opportunities. I had to sort of limit myself to what I had to look, because there's a lot of overlapping ideas. But yeah, the circus, that's one of the big draw cards as well that came into those theatres.
In 1842, you said, I think it was the Lamb's Head or
The Lamb's Inn.
So the pubs would have been popular, but were women allowed in the pubs then? Or did they stay home?
Yeah. So there was a lot of publicans as well that were female. And so, yeah, I mean, when there's books, there's a great book actually that we've just got in the office about female publicans. But yeah, it was segregated a lot. Also, I mean, early colony-wise, as I was saying, the sort of the numbering of men to women as well meant that a lot of those establishments would have been catered for men. That's not to say that women didn't come in or something happened, but yeah, they were catered for men. There was also an example that I read at the back of that Lamb's Inn was an even worse pub, where they just threw food out onto the table that you would grab. You would pay your money at the door, they would throw the food out, you would grab whatever you could in terms of joints of meat, and you would grab whatever drink you could, and then you would stay there overnight, because obviously the point was to get pretty drunk. So you would stay there overnight as well. But yeah, so I guess in that sense, there was at least some formality to that front part compared to where the back part was. So yeah.
Sounds like something like Blackadder.
I just wondered, Jarrad, if you noticed in all of your analysis you've done over the past few years about changes in style of joints of meat. I know you talked about heavy stews and things, but like were there cuts that were favoured in, say, the 1840s, 50s, that then went out of style by the 1890s?
Yeah.
Any changes in?
I think not so much the cuts of meat, more to do with the actual meals themselves, favouring then the animal bones or the percentage of animal bones themselves. And then in terms of what types of cuts of meat, more to do with the social aspect, I guess, of the people that were living there, trying to match that up with whatever historical records that we can have and what types of occupations we had. For example, one of the exploration lane, for example, had quite a lot of sheep metapodals, which were you find quite commonly in butcher sites as butcher's waste. It's the type of bone that no one's interested in, which is why they're also great for making tools in prehistory, if anyone's interested in that as well. But yeah, cuts of meat, it's more related to the social aspects rather than a time period and the actual then types of animals, introduction of animals. But sheep/goat is our favourite. Mutton, everyone loves a bit of mutton, and it's frequent across every pretty much site in the CBD. You're going to find some sort of sheep-goat remains, which is mutton, and it's pretty popular. So it's more to do with the little nuances, I think, side by side.
We've actually got a question from the chat on the live stream. So, how safe was it for women to go out by themselves during the years that we've been talking about?
Again, it depends on the woman, I think it's actually quite. I think it's we look at a lot of these pictures. Some of the pictures also I showed tonight. A lot of them are illustrations, of course, they're not photos, and a lot of them are depicting an idealized version of what's actually happening on the streets with people going out. So again, I would answer that with saying that it's the type of woman and whether I would feel comfortable or not. But societally, normally societal pressure would say that you would be out with a man. However,
with the building of the new underground railway in the city, has any surprises come to light? Because why I ask, one of my interests is I study the building of underground railways all over the world, and nearly every article I've read, they said, they've discovered some old tool or something. Has it happened in Melbourne?
Yeah, I mean, it's extensive. We weren't involved with that type of work. Other companies have been involved with that. However, like the discoveries that have come up and the reports that have come out has been, I would say it's probably one of the largest projects in the CBD for finding information and pushing that forward. I guess before that was sort of the Commonwealth block sites, Castle and Place. But in terms of I guess the 2010s, this modern period, this is going to be the site and the sites that get studied the most due to the amount of remains. I think even last year I was sitting on a talk where they just one section of the site had uncovered a dumping ground for ceramics, for example, and that was tens of thousands of ceramics fragments that they had found from manufacturers that couldn't sell their wares, and so where else are you going to dump it? Just throw it in the backyard, which happened in Melbourne a lot without organised waste.
So they've been discovered, haven't they?
Yeah, so there's and that's just one example of a small site, and but there's a lot of information out there, especially in the reports that are coming and also have been published.
And at the beginning of the talk, you talked about what limited time you had to get onto sites when there's a private development. But who pays for the archaeological work?
It's true. And so we're always beholden to our clients. Of course. I think it's more just that we're quite lucky. I've worked also on the research side, on research digs as well, which is trying to find funding from wherever you can. And so to be able to work in an environment where you know that you do have a time period to get in and be able to do it, that is protected by law and protected by state law with pretty heavy penalties, it means that we can actually get on site. And like I said, even if it is in a restricted time frame, we can actually get in and look at what we can look at and start understanding a little bit more of, like what I said at the start as well, that a lot of the historical sources tend to reflect middle and upper class, but a lot of the archaeological remains can help us understand a lot of the lower classes. So, we do work within those timeframes, but we should be lucky though.
But is it the builder, the person who owns the site that has to pay for your work?
It's complicated. It depends. It's site by site, depending on the project. If it's government, whether it's private, it's quite complicated in terms of exactly who's paying for what. But at the end of the day, we're on site to find exactly what we need to find. So.
Linked with that, you're saying it, most of them digs are developer-led because they're knocking down stuff to build something much bigger and modern. Where you've got, obviously with the artefacts, you can pick them up, take them away and preserve them and do whatever you want to do with them. But where you've got foundations that are interesting, such as the ones we saw on Lonsdale Street, and you build some giant thing on, the developer's going to build some giant thing on top. What is much done to actually preserve those foundations and in turn make them visible?
It's actually one of the it's probably
glass floors.
It's the number one thing I would say when we're digging in the CBD. People walk past and say, "Can't we just put a glass floor here?" But normally with CBD developments, and it's just modern construction. It's dig down as deep as you can to create a car park space or a basement to allow then the stories above for you to be able to live and occupy.
It still goes.
But in some cases, you can, depending on the CBD, unless you've got something.
The problem is the planning permit for the developer is issued often before we're on site, before we've discovered all that process has started. The planning approvals, obviously they want to maximise, car parking space, footprints and things like that. So the developer does too. So often archaeology is like, it's discovered too late in that process often. So,
That can't change planning permits, they can't
sometimes it depends on where we find structural remains, like sometimes there's an opportunity, say, if it's near the front of the building, like the front of the site, that might be where the foyer is and where whatever's going to happen, and so there might be an opportunity. Often it's usually right in the middle where the lift core is going to go or something that we actually find really well preserved, say bluestone footings or cellar or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, really, you know, to be honest, Heritage Victoria are always looking for those opportunities and trying to work with us to work with the developer to try to find those opportunities. But yeah, it's not always easy. Sorry, Jack.
Thank you for a night on the town.
Thank you.
We've all enjoyed the history coming to life through your stories and your expertise and what you've shown. So that's a small gift for you. If you like what you've heard tonight, we have a lot of these events throughout the year. If you're not already on our mailing list, leave your details online and we'll room there before you leave. Have a look at our exhibition here, Connect City. As Jarrad mentioned, it's also on the other side of the school too. We'll take a stroll around there. We've got it till the 14th of March, so a bit of time yet. And enjoy some more tea and biscuits if you like. And thank you all very much for coming along. Thank you.